the ability to get into another person's world so that you really not agree or disagree, but understand, and that you are genuine and have integrity in your efforts to understand, so that they feel so valued and affirmed that they are being understood. I think that what areas to the body to be understood is to the heart. And I find that when people have that experience, negative and defensive energy is transformed into positive, creative energy.
You know, actually, if I could then switch to Barbara a little bit and talk about negative emotions and negative energy. I know Barbara has done a lot of really fascinating work on presidential performance, and at least two presidents, Nixon and Lyndon Johnson, seem to have problems with negative emotions, paranoia, depression, and other things. And I would love to get her reaction to the downside of emotions.
Am I supposed to have a motion?
That would be lovely.
How's this? Thank you, Rod. I was not prepared for you to call on me on negative emotions. I'm such a woman of sunshine and positive attitudes all the time that I have no idea what to say about negative feelings and behaviors. Yes, the book Bad Leadership that was referred to once or twice is filled with negative, not only emotions, but seeing the world as a dark and gloomy place. But it's not only about that. It's about bringing to our field, and I really want to open up the conversation a tiny bit, and then I'll just go on to what I thought I was going to say until Rod sprung this on me. I really do want to open. Warren is in fact, the real thing that is a man filled with sunshine and happiness almost all of the time. I take a different approach. I take an approach that looks at the world in a somewhat more, again, dark, complex, if you will, way, and I'm very much hoping that we can elicit some conversation that speaks specifically to what was brought up earlier, which is we have a sense that something is going radically wrong. We have a hard time pinpointing exactly what it is, and I'm hoping as the day wears on we'll get a slightly more sophisticated understanding of what exactly was alluded to in the first panel as something is awry. What more precisely is that? Let me just use this occasion, because I'm not sure I'll have the mic in my hand in another moment, to say what I was going to say, and it's really just to elaborate on the nature of the panel and to remind ourselves that we are, after all, here at Harvard University. I like to think of leadership, taking all these other things into account. I like to think of leadership also as an exercise that has a foundation that is purely, if I may use the word, intellectual. And I would like to argue that much of the wisdom that we are talking about and trying to cultivate in our leaders comes from a kind of broad liberal arts mentality that we are able, as we grow older and presumably wiser, to absorb into how we see the world. And let me just indicate 4 general areas of, if you will, education that I would argue every leader should have. 1, theory. I know it's not a popular word, even around a university, but the field of leadership, particularly modern leadership studies, has developed a body of material that it's not exactly a mistake to impart to would-be leaders. 2nd, as I just suggested a few moments ago, the world of liberal arts, political science, sociology, psychology, history. How can you develop a mature, wise, thoughtful, balanced, global leader in the 21st century unless you educate also for the liberal arts? 3rd, taking a cue from the word liberal arts, the word arts. Reference has already been made to Shakespeare. One of Warren's great attributes is a familiarity with Shakespeare, as we just heard. But I would argue it's not only Shakespearean lore that we should be mastering, but the graphic arts, film, fiction, poetry. There is so much in the world of arts that applies to growing an individual, and those arts matter. So you have theory, you have liberal arts, you have arts, and finally, let me end with the world of ideas. I teach a course here at Harvard that I call leadership literacy. What is leadership literacy? I wish I could make it sound archaic and inaccessible and unavailable, available only, that is, to the best and the brightest, but it's quite the opposite. It is really a great books course. The great books that pertain directly and precisely to the great thinking on leadership. Lao Tzu, Plato, Aristotle, James Madison, Machiavelli, Hitler, if I may say so, Mein Kampf, Lenin. How do you understand history and leadership? How do you understand leadership without, for example, knowing some Freud? How do you understand leadership in the late 21st century without knowing the writings of Betty Friedan and Martin Luther King? So I commend to you the world of theory, the world of liberal arts, the world of arts, and put simply, the world of ideas in addition to the cognition and emotion that's being discussed here. Rod, did I do it?
Thank you.
Is this okay? Rod,
Thank you, Barbara.
am I allowed?
Actually, you very deftly segued from the surprise question I wanted to give you to a prepared statement, so very nicely done. I actually want to deliberately engage people early on from the audience, so I'm going to give you a moment to formulate any questions and thoughts you have, especially questions you might want to direct to our distinguished panelists. So I'll move around a little bit till I see a hand. But from the beginning, why don't we go ahead? Yes. Let me hand you my mic, or do you have one there?
My name is Phyllis Bennis. Warren is my uncle. I'm very proud of him. And I want to refer back to a conversation that he and I had some years ago, because it goes directly to this question of how we assess what is good leadership and bad leadership. And my concern here is when good leaders use good leadership tactics to do bad things, and how we make judgments about what is good leadership. And the conversation that I had with Warren, I don't know if you remember this, was about one of the examples in his work on small group leadership. It was about the Manhattan Project. And it was about the question of Oppenheimer as a great leader. And clearly, the assessment of Oppenheimer as a great leader is accurate in terms of his capacity to pull together these very diverse sections of scientists who came with very different assessments and manage them into an extraordinary, capable team that pulled off this extraordinary feat. And wouldn't the world have been far better off if he had failed? If he had been a worse leader, if he had failed with that team and the nuclear weapon had never been built? I would assert that that is an unquestionable reality. And what it leads to is this question of what it means to segregate out the question of leadership as a separate issue, not a separate science, because science is all about separating out issues, but when we think about it in the context of good leadership, bad leadership, can we do that without taking into account what the consequences are of that leadership? So when we talk about the question of cognition and emotion, doesn't the cognition side have to begin and end with what are we trying to accomplish? With making a cognitive assessment of what is our goal in trying to accomplish this. And I would say that this question of looking at models of accomplishment without a critical assessment of what the goal is and whether that's a useful goal socially. So this notion, for example, of seeing FDR as someone who made people think they were participating in something and pulling them in my view, that's a really false notion of leadership. What made FDR successful, I think, was that there were social movements that were on the march, that people were participating in. And FDR was able to speak to that and to encourage that, but he didn't create that. He was not giving people the sense of something that wasn't real. It was real because they were already engaged. And the opposite of that, I would say, would be in a corporate setting, giving workers the sense that they are participants, that they are associates rather than employees, as if they had equal power, as if it was not possible to fire them because they are valued. I think that's a very different version of what leadership is. So I guess I would question this issue, not addressed to anyone in particular, but in a broader sense, this question of how do we define what is good leadership cognitively in the context of what it accomplishes for those who are being led.
Great. Thank you very much. David?
I'd love to go to the panel and ask them to get back to the point that Warren was making in the film. That decision-making is fundamental. It's the fundament for for leaders. And you brought up the point, and when we were growing up, we were all told to suppress our emotions, to think rationally, to make decisions rationally. And now there's this new research coming out of neuroscience, which is telling us something different. And I think it's important for all of us to know, what is it that's telling us? What are we learning from neuroscience that we should apply in thinking about better leadership decision making? I'd really be curious to hear from the panel about that.
Actually, I was going, Ken, please go ahead.
I think we're bringing up some really important things about, what is leadership all about, and I love the idea, Warren, of you interrogating your experiences. And I've been thinking the last 6 months or more very clearly about an experience I had in a safari in Africa, and I had been on a number of safaris, Marge and I and friends, and right before that safari, we were at a dinner party, and the host and hostess said, "Why don't we go around the table as we talk and share, if you could have dinner with anybody in the world who's still alive, who would you like to have dinner with?" And when it got to me, it was a really quick choice. I said, "I'd like to have dinner with Nelson Mandela," because I'd love to have dinner with somebody who was mistreated, in jail for 28 years, abused and all. We went to Robbins Island after the safari and saw what kind of conditions he lived in. And he comes out of that with love, compassion, reconciliation, and all. And so I decided I was going to try to find out as much as I could about Nelson Mandela on the trip. And so I got a copy of A Long Walk to Freedom about his life. And then suddenly we're in the jungle, and I've been there many times before. And what I saw more vividly than ever before is how vicious the jungle is, how competitive the jungle is, how territorial the jungle is, and how self-oriented the jungle is. I don't know if anybody here has ever been close to a lion when they roar, but it will pull a chill up your back. And our guide, when he imitates the roar of a lion, always says the lion is saying, "It's mine! It's mine! It's mine!" And he said, that's really what the lion's saying. "Baby, this is my territory. You mess with me, you're in trouble." And a lion will kill their sons if they challenge their territory. And what struck me, as in the context of finding out about Nelson Mandela, is that we're supposed to be intelligent animals. And as intelligent animals, we can choose on a daily basis between the flesh, which is very self-oriented, and it's not, a sense of self, it's a sense of self as the whole deal, whether it's through fear or false pride or what have you. You're the big deal, and it's your territory and all. And the choice of the spirit, which is for a higher good and all. And it just struck me that what's happening too often among leaders in the world is they're choosing the flesh. They're making decisions and all, maybe they're using their judgment and all, but it's all about them. It's their political future. We look at what's happened in the leadership of countries, of churches, of businesses. We've just had enough of self-oriented leaders who really think that leadership is about them, not about anybody else. And how we rise that to a higher level of Steve Belkin and his family, and Marge and I have gone through the Hoffman process, which is a really interesting process that has this tranquility where you're really looking at your intellect, your emotion, your spirit, and your body. But one of the most dramatic experiences they have is you have this arguments between your intellect and your emotion, which we all do. But unless our spirit is in the center of that, unless we're focused on something higher and more meaningful than us, then this is just a vicious debate that somehow comes out with some people are emotional decision makers, other intellectual decision makers, but it doesn't matter, that all ends up with them. And I've really got interested in how can we at Harvard all over the place really get into our leadership training, getting right into people's hearts about their intentions of leading. Why are they doing it in the first place? Are they doing it for their own self, or are they doing it for the betterment of others? And I think that's the issue to me that just kind of gnaws at me. The world is in desperate need of a different leadership role model. And I reflected when I was on safari, one last comment, about reading Paulo Freire's book in the 70s. Some of you probably read it. He was a revolutionary from Brazil. But he wrote a fabulous book called The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And he said the problem with oppression, and the reality is there's a lot of oppression all over the world still, is that when the oppressed finally throw off the oppressor, unfortunately, the only leadership role model they have is the oppressor, and so the oppressed become the new oppressor. And I saw that even friends of mine who, when we were young, they couldn't stand that all the money, power, and recognition in business went up the hierarchy. But when they finally made it up to the top, man, they really liked it themselves. And how do we deal with that? It's different than sense of self you're talking about, Warren. It's just an over thought about our own importance.
You know, I would love to get Noel's observations, since he's working on a book on judgment and consequences in some ways at this very point.
Well, actually, the little unfinished business from this. I came late and heard that Jim O'Toole and Warren Bennis were writing the book, and I guess I'm off the book. It's actually Warren and I. Actually, you heard it's Warren and I that are doing the book, and we've been unfinished for 4 years. But we really got onto this topic of saying, hey, look at what we've done, both of us in our work, and what's in the field, and there's missing something. And so we said, you know, what it's missing is anybody doing a good job of framing leaders making judgment calls at the top of institutions. We started wrestling with that, and we said there are really three domains. People, who's on the team, off the team, strategy, what mountain do we climb, and every organization has a crisis. Most of the decision-making literature is, and there are wonderful pieces there, Max certainly has contributed a lot, other people in this room, but there aren't any really good framing of, well, how do you decide who's the CEO puts on the team or off the team? You know, and if you don't get that right, how the hell are you going to get the strategy right? Because you got a bunch of people who are, you know, fighting with each other or aren't aligned, so you're in trouble on the strategy. And when a crisis comes, you get into a problem there. So we said, let's go out and have conversations with some leaders who are in those roles. As a matter of fact, one's in the room. I think, is Bill George here yet? Bill George, I think he's coming at some point. And he's teaching right now. He's teaching now, but he'll be here later. And, you know, CEO of Medtronic, and we've been talking to Jeff Immelt at GE, A.G. Lafley, Joel Klein, running the Chancellor of Schools in New York City, both public sector and private sector organizations. And how do you make the judgment call? And good ones and bad ones. We all make some. And I'll give you just two examples, and then, you know, get us thinking about it, because everyone in this room who's been a leader has a batting average, and it ain't all good. But hopefully on the important ones it works out. A bad one, if you look at it on the surface, Merck is the Vioxx situation. Merck's market cap is half of what it was when Ray Gilmartin came in. The case has really put them in high jeopardy, and you might say not handling a crisis well. Or you might take it back to strategy. Our digging into that says you go back to the real deal, and that was a bad people decision. I remember actually working with Roy Vagelos, the former CEO. Dick Markham was the heir apparent. They were going to launch an executive program that we were going to help work with them on. Get a call Friday afternoon. He said Dick Markham crossed an ethical boundary. He's fired out of the company. He had no successor. So he goes running around. Larry Bossidy's on the board, running Allied Signal at the time. Asked Larry, would you like to be CEO of Merck? Larry said, no, I'm going to stay at Allied. They ran around, they hired Ray Gilmartin. Wonderful gentleman running Becton Dickinson. In our view, bad judgment call, little popcorn stand compared to Merck, not any background in the pharmaceutical industry, very powerful group in the R&D lab there. Roy Vagelos, a very well-known scientist before he came there, could do the checks and balances. It's not by accident that they're in trouble, in our view. And we would say the root cause of that was a people decision. We could peel the onion on Carly at HP. And it probably was a people judgment call, not strategy. Hurd is in there driving the same strategy now, mobilizing people and making it work. One last story that and again, we're trying to frame these kinds of issues at this level, and the more we looked in the literature, from Herb Simon back to, you know, Graham Allison stuff on decision making in political arena, to Irving Janet, to Max's work, the pieces don't yet come together. So we're really clinically framing them. And I'll give you one good example of a judgment call. A.G. Lafley comes into P&G. If you know this story, Dirk Yager got pushed out. He gets a call, flies into Cincinnati. He's told the next morning, you're the new CEO. He said after coming in, the stock goes down 30%. He says a real confidence builder. Baby care business was tanking. And it was dominated diapers, dominated by engineers who knew how to fine-tune the machines and make sure the diapers were perfect. And Lafley says they're not in touch with the market. So he finds this woman, Deb Henretta, who's a marketing person, has no engineering degree, 38 years old, and makes the judgment call, she's going to run the business. He was feeling pretty good until an hour later, all of his vice chairmen, one at a time, came into his office. The presidents, the heads of the businesses came in. You're out of your mind. You're crazy. Bad judgment call. You're going to ruin the company. So he calls a meeting the next morning. 10 of them around the table, one at a time. Give me your candidate. Make your case. And I want everyone to have a hearing. Thank you. I appreciate your input. We're going with Deb. Here's why. And then he stayed with it, and he, knock on wood, says, thank God she succeeded or I was over. But if you peel that back, a couple things. We look at a judgment call as preparation, the call, and a call is only good if it succeeds. And it does get you into some issues of what's good for society, what's good for the organization, but our view is it's none of this, the operation was successful, but the patient died. No. Deb succeeded, the business turned around. And the leader's job is to stay, and he had to stay with Deb in the execution phase. He had to ride shotgun, people were out to get her, and his job as a leader was not just the prep, not just the call, but to stay and ensure that call was made. So we're wrestling with, and in this, obviously, is cognition, is emotion, is the things Warren actually, that was the introduction to the book. I wish you'd get it revised a little, Warren, so we have it done. But you know, what Warren was talking about on the video is really kind of the beginning of the framing of it. But that's what we're wrestling with.
Thank you. Max has been anxious to...
First of all, I apologize. I have a teaching commitment, so I'll be leaving soon. But I wanted to sort of follow up. No, I agree with your assessment of the decision-making literature. There's a part of the area that was studied very well for a long period of time, and other parts were ignored. And going back to David's question, this interaction between emotion and cognition, I think is one of those. A long time ago, Howard Rafa, professor emeritus from the Harvard Business School and the Kennedy School, argued that when your gut is inconsistent with your sort of logical analysis, that's a hint that one of them is off. And that's a hint for more to think harder about that problem. So that when there's an inconsistency between the various parts that might provide insight, that's when we need to think harder about it. And when they converge, we can move forward more quickly. Malcolm Gladwell provides a convincing case that sometimes your quick gut response is good. I think he ignores the fact that a large percent of the time it's truly terrible. And when I connect that to leadership, I think that the overwhelming example on this story is the morning after 9/11. And Richard Clarke nicely documents in his book Against All Enemies that after working hard on 9/11 as a terrorism czar, he goes home, sleeps 4 hours, he returns to find Cheney, Rumsfeld, and Wolfowitz sitting around the table identifying the role that Iraq had to play in 9/11. So there was a quick blink response that Iraq must be involved. And then what we saw in this country was a search for confirming evidence of their hypothesis. And there's ample cognitive evidence that if you have a hypothesis and you only look for evidence that you're right, you can find it. Okay? Unfortunately, you can find it even when you're wrong. And what we need is to develop better mechanisms, and that may be with other people or it may be within yourself, to compare analysis with gut intuition till you have a basis for coming to a more confident conclusion. And that was something that was sorely lacking.
Thank you, Max. Let me move out. Any questions, reactions, comments? So, Stephen, and actually, let me take one out here. Stephen, we'll come back to you. Let me hand you my mic unless there's one close by. Okay.
Hi, my name is Barry Taylor. I do a lot of work in healing. And so I appreciate you coming back to what Steve said earlier, Ken said, Werner said earlier. The issue of how we regulate ourselves or how we bring forth emotions, or I don't call them emotions, but certain abstractions. I'm leading a group of people now, I have since 1981, in the world of acceptance, trust, compassion, something that's not reactive. So the issue of, we're talking about leading a company or leading others, and yet we all are faced with the dilemma and challenges of how we're self-led, being involved with what Ken said in the Hoffman process, of the warring that goes on between our intellect and our emotions. So I'm interested in dialoguing and hearing, Werner, what you've been discovering working with the actors in terms of what you see, how we can leave a few hours from now, what could we be accessing within ourselves so that certain things, so we're not hijacked by just our mind and how we get caught in that web of entanglement. We're not just hijacked in thinking that our emotions, when there are things, this group I'm leading now, that's why I can't come this evening, the first week I've engaged people in a conversation of gratitude and gratefulness. And the energy of some of that stuff is so powerful in terms of healing. If you really ask people to enter into a conversation of gratefulness over time, what blocks it, what calls it forth. So I'm very interested in hearing from Ken, from Werner, what do you see allows people to gain more access to self-leadership?
And Margie, too, I think.
Yeah. You know, I actually believe that there's a polarity going on here. And one side of it is what you know. And we're all very smart people, and we know a lot, and we've lived for a long time. There's another part of it that I'd like to challenge you with, and it's educated incapacity. It's knowing so much that you don't know, and accepting that there is a piece of you that is getting in the way of seeing the obvious things that other people see, or the things at the edges. And when I sit in a leadership situation and I think, what do I know that I need to own? There's some downsides to that. And what do I not know that I need to investigate and open up? I think we own two sides of our judgment, and it's where some emotions come in to that. But in running the Office of the Future, one of the things that I am really trying very hard to do is to figure out how can we listen to some other people than just ourselves? How can we listen to teenagers? We had a group of people in talking about gaming as a way to teach and to learn, and everybody thought, well, that's cute, that's nice. But when we had teenagers in there talking to us about what was exciting about learning and games, it was things that we don't do in learning. We don't have levels of learning. We don't let people make decisions every 30 seconds. We don't do a lot of things that maybe if we could admit that we have blinders on because we know so much, that we could become curious and we could become humble and we could let more people in to helping us. So who do you put on the team is going to be important, or at least who accesses the team and who are you going to listen to? Because I actually believe there's a polarity going on that I have to manage in myself as a leader. And one of the most dangerous things is not paying attention to what I really know and not fighting for it. And it's equally dangerous to think I really do know exactly what hill we're going to climb and what it's going to look like when we get there. And maybe I ought to be paying attention to some of the other things. So it's a continual struggle that at least I know I go through.
I know, Stephen, you have to leave early, so let me turn it to you.
We've talked a lot about Gandhi. He never was elected. He never was appointed. His leadership was moral authority. It wasn't formal authority. I did have a visit with Nelson Mandela about a week ago down in South Africa at the Nelson Mandela Institute. And I asked him, how long did it take you to get over the anger and the the bitterness of the injustices and the indignities and the tortures that you suffered in Robben Island. And he said, 6 or 7 years. He said, I said, what happened? He said, I gradually began to see the goodness in some of the guards. And I started to realize they too were victims of this evil apartheid system, and that they had to be liberated as well as those who had been victimized and oppressed. And he said, the more I looked at that and came to see the goodness in people, he said, it started to grow in me. So as you know, when he came to his own inauguration, after President de Klerk freed him, who was really a partner with him, he had the formal authority and Nelson Mandela had the moral authority. He came down the middle aisle. There on the front row were his loved ones. On the left side, on the right side were his warders, his jailers. He bows to them. Good morning, gentlemen. He has what Ken talks about. He had this transformation inside his soul, inside his spirit. Then he brings in the ANC choir to sing the Afrikaner anthem, and the Afrikaner choir to sing the ANC anthem. And he just transcends his own history. His moral authority came in Robben Island. And I think that the concept that leadership is a position and that we're critical of certain leaders, I think puts us into a false dichotomy. I think that the reason why I admire Warren so much is I see him as a trim tabber, the small rudder that turns the big rudder, that turns the whole ship. Look at the influence of his life and his work and his teaching on all of us. And that didn't come from formal authority. Leadership is a choice, not a position. Every time I go into a group where I'm teaching, I ask this question. How many of you have achieved your level of success partly or largely because someone believed in you when you didn't believe in yourself? And literally 2/3 of the room raise their hands. And I walk around with the mic like you're doing and ask, what was your experience? Who was it? What did they do? What were the results? What were the effects upon you? And they get very emotional. And the audience gets emotional when they hear some of these stories, because they come to realize, look at the moral authority of a grandmother or of a coach or a scout leader or a boss or someone at a critical stage in that person's life, or maybe not even a critical stage, but just someone who believed in them and affirmed them so deeply. To me, that's the essence of leadership, is the affirmation of the worth and potential of another person. So clearly they come to see it in themselves. And then that brings what is potentially inside them more out. And if they act upon it, then they find their voice in helping other people find their voice. I just had dinner also with this Muhammad Yunus, who started the Grameen Bank. $4.5 billion in loans now, and has brought hundreds and hundreds of thousands of women out of poverty, out of grinding poverty, and their families. And it's even countercultural, because usually the men control the economic side. And just an amazing thing. Now it's spreading throughout the world. Pravalad wrote about it in the book, The Fortune at the Bottom of the Pyramid, how microcredit, microenterprise, micro-learning is spreading everywhere. We're making a film with Muhammad Yunus, and the last statement he makes in the film is, if we will follow these principles, he's talking about leadership being a choice, not a position. If we will follow these principles, we will solve the poverty problem in 5 to 10 years, not 50 to 100 years. So I think all of us, in a sense, can be change catalysts, can be trim tabbers like Warren is to us, and that we can exercise influence and avoid the overweening tendency to just find fault and to look for the weaknesses in formal, appointed, or elected leaders. That has its place. I don't deny that. And the discussion about it helps also. I'm convinced that it lifts the dialogue. But I think for all of us in our roles as parents, as teachers, in whatever role we are, if we just try to cultivate the choice of living by principles and having a higher purpose. I'm working on a project now to build a vision of Viktor Frankl, the Statue of Responsibility. It would be of the same scope and size as the Statue of Liberty on the East Coast. This would be in the Puget Sound area, right outside of Seattle on an island that's been selected. It would have an international walkway and museum that would show every nation manifesting how they perceive responsibility combined with liberty in their culture. Because as Viktor Frankl mentioned, liberty is only half the deal. The rest of it is that we use that liberty responsibly. And the present artistic rendition is of an arm reaching down, lifting another arm. So that what we are about, we're in the same boat. We lift other people wherever we are. We're highly interdependent. I really do believe that the essence of management is formal authority, but the essence of leadership is moral authority.
You're getting a lot of responses. Yes, sir. Do we have a mic close by? Yes.
Hi, I'm Sam Culbert. I teach at the Anderson Graduate School of Management, UCLA. The issue, I think, today is how do we prepare people who are going to take leadership positions to deal with emotions and to exercise good judgment. And about 2 years ago, one of our doctoral students, Jean-Francois Coget, did a study where he looked at people in leadership situations when things went bad and they got thrown for it. And everybody has an espoused theory of leadership. Everybody knows what they'd like to do when they're a leader. But then everybody's different. Something throws each individual. When do we teach students what happens to them psychologically and behaviorally and their impact on other people when the situation goes poorly and they lose it for a while? In the synapse of time between losing it and regaining it. And they don't create so much mischief in the world. That, I think, is part of the leadership education. The question stems from emotions are important. Self-psychology is important. We've got to do a better job of preparing people and preparing them to utilize the feedback that's all around them that they could see with their own eyes. But for each individual, it's a different personal path back.
Thank you, Sam, very much. And, sir.
I haven't heard the word courage all morning. And I wonder why. I seem to think that we all are in the same boat. And that is a temporary visa on this earth. And I think we need to begin understanding that. And therefore, what will we do with that temporary visa? Birth, death, the journey in between. I am inclined to the emotional. Warren has been a wonderful mentor to try to help me deal with the emotion. I say outrageous things. I do outrageous things. I pound the table in anger. I don't believe we should leave victims behind, for they will come back and let us be remembered as victimizers. I am grateful. I'm not a leader. Somehow accidentally I've been placed in leadership positions. But without the collaboration, of the mentors in this room to say to me, Uri, you have to bring your heart and head and somehow place them within the same boundaries. But frankly, I can't do it alone. Leadership is partnership. And it's not the partnership of like people. It's the partnership when the emotion and the cerebral are not necessarily in the same place, but together, just as the biblical Moses stammered as he appealed to the Pharaoh and needed Aaron, his brother, next to him to interpret his emotion to liberate a people. We need the Moseses and we need the Aarons in the same room to have victory over the complicity that I think is very much a major problem in this world today and since the beginning of time. Rwanda and Darfur has not been mentioned today, but one of your faculty members is Samantha Power, and she did win the Pulitzer. And the title of the book is A Problem from Hell, the history of genocide. We are living with a problem from hell. And unless we find the Moseses and Aarons to figure out together how to bring the heart and the head together, we will remain with a problem from hell, and our temporary visa will be hell instead of a pilot of hope.
Way in the back, there's a person who's been very patiently waiting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Marianella Sclavi. I am Italian. I am visiting professor at MIT, and I teach intercultural listening. And I teach how to use judgment and emotions, starting from an intercultural conflict situation. So, and I didn't hear here anybody talk about it, while I think that intercultural mishaps, misunderstanding and conflicts are a very interesting ground to learn to interpret emotions in the right way and use them in a positive way, constructive way. If I am in a situation where the other people's behavior has a meaning for him or her, which is the opposite of the meaning that I give, and we are both right, because in our own cultures it is like that. So looking at the old person in the eyes in one culture has a meaning of respect, in the other has the opposite meaning of disrespect. So I am angry with that behavior, and I see it as disrespect. What does this anger tell me? How do I interpret this kind of emotion? In that situation, it is clear that that emotion means this is how I am accustomed to interpret this kind of behavior. So emotions tell me how my body interprets in an automatic way a kind of event or behavior, and starting from this kind of, if I interpret emotion in this way, emotions are all positive. The negative emotions are extremely positive because they tell me something very important about body language and about one possibility that my body is choosing, and I can say, okay, this is the way I interpret this situation through my emotions. Let us see if there are other possibilities of interpretation, and then I must play with what is called dislocation, how to shift from one position to the other, which is what I call a humorous also kind of attitude. So I think that teaching how to listen to people of a different culture is a very good gymnasium or training ground to learn how to interpret emotions and judgment. I would like to have some reactions about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes. Ron, please.
Ron Dezoritz, I'm a psychiatrist. I'm humbled by being here today with the magnificence of this group and even spending a minute or two representing Warren. On a more practical side, I think we need to consider a couple points. Leaders clearly have to understand who they are as people and where their moral fiber is. They have to understand clearly who they are leading and what their audience is, whether you are in a classroom or you are running the country. And I will just give you one or two practical points to think about. Great leaders, I feel, are most frequently judged by how they handle crises. And you look at FDR, you look at Jimmy Carter, and you look at Ronald Reagan. You look at people who have handled and been in situations where crisis has struck them, and you look at the people who have handled the Tylenol situation years ago. Jimmy Carter had a crisis, and he made all of us feel like we were in a crisis. If you went to the White House, it was dark, it was dreary, and he was feeling that he was empathizing with the country, where in reality what he needed to do was to lead the country. And the country chose a different leader who in fact was leading us. When you look at the situation where the leader of a massive pharmaceutical company had an issue, he dealt with it head on, straightforward, handled it, and it was over. And then you look at other people handling crises, and if they don't handle them on the spot, fast, and I'm sure Mr. Schultz knows this, that every business, every classroom, every organization has crises. How one handles these crises and deals with them is essential to what you are going to do with that organization going forward. And my wife wants me to tell you about one practical thing I had personally, which will take me a minute, and I appreciate your listening. I've been in business for many years, 30 years, and I run a very large company with thousands of employees. And one of my key elements is that by the nature of what I do in healthcare, we're always in trouble. There's just always something going on. And the nature of behavioral healthcare is that when you treat millions and millions of people, somebody is always not going to be happy. It's just the way it is, and you have to learn to deal with it. Well, one of the big things I had was the government had changed a policy of treating young people in a certain area. We were doing business in Virginia, and we were obligated to live with that. And then several of these young families were not getting treatment we wanted to give them. We were instructed we couldn't do it. And that resulted in a congressional hearing. And I literally had 2,000 people, senators from the state, all the congressmen, must have been 100 people from the military with all of their uniforms, the press hanging around, all over television, and I'm in this big audience with my wife, which I'll never forget. And I'm at a table, and I'm supposed to defend the government. And this is an hour and a half of listening to these families talk about the problems with their young children. And I felt terrible as I do this. I felt terrible about it. And I've got this presentation, an hour in listening, and it's now my turn to get up there. I get up on the stage, and I take my presentation. I said, I can't do anything with this presentation. I promise you I will treat every one of you in our facilities as long as you need it, as long as you live, for nothing. Ever. And that was the end of it. It was a one-day story, and it was over. And I learned myself that the best way to handle things like this is to deal with them head on, and we've had many, many since then. But to deal with them head on, do it with your heart, do it with your emotions, do it with how you feel at that moment. And that will be a symbol of how one wants to lead that organization. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Ryan. You know, ladies and gentlemen, our time for conversation is coming to a close, and so I'd like to give Warren the second to last word, or last word, but I also want to give Werner Erhard one more chance to offer some reflective comments. You've been very patient.
I was thinking that the word decision is what got wound up with from judgment and emotion. And I have found it useful in my own thoughts to distinguish between deciding and choosing. And etymologically, deciding has to do with killing off the alternative. And if I remember the definition of choice, it's to select freely and after consideration. So this after consideration part got me thinking. And I guess the most challenging choices are the ones in which it's not possible to get a preponderance of evidence for one side or the other, where the outcome is unpredictable, where you can't get the right choice. You make a choice, and you can't, but you wind up with the choice you've made, not with a choice that you can say is the right choice. It's not a choice you can defend, it's a choice for which you wind up being responsible and need to be responsible. And I shared with you about working with actors to find something out about being able to bring forth an emotion. One of the things, so we used the whole metaphor, the theater. And one of the things we looked at was the first act, the second act, and the third act in a three-act play. And the reason we looked at a three-act play was because we all do things in a certain temporality, certain kind of time. And the kind of time in which we all do what we do is, said as simply as you can say it, is past, present, and future. And that worked out pretty well for the three-act play. And then looking at it from that perspective, the past is over, I can't do anything about it, the first act is over. I can maybe draw on what happened in the first act, but it's over. And the third act is the future, that's yet to come. So the second act is the, let's call it the current era of my life, or the current era of this enterprise, or the current era of any entity. And looked at from the perspective of a three-act play, looking at this temporality in which we all have to function, from the perspective of a three-act play, it's interesting about the second act. Because while I ought to be able, in the current era of my life, to live a life of choice. I can't live a life of choice about the past because it's over. Can't live a life of choice about the future because it hasn't gotten here yet. But I ought to be able to make some choices about the current era of my life. Well, if you look at this temporality from the three-act play perspective, the second act is in a certain sense already written in the following way. The second act has to bridge from the first act to the third act. It can't be a disconnect. It's got to somehow get me from the end of the first act, the end of my past, to the beginning of my future. And in addition to which, it's got to be entirely consistent with the third act. I can't, for example, in the third act, be a dancer, and in the second act, be in an accident and lose my legs. So, that won't work very well. So, in a certain sense, the current era of my life is already written. Now, the wonderful thing about this metaphor is that the script for the third act isn't written yet. That's up to me. And that's an interesting thought for me, and something that I've found made a great deal of difference in my ability to make choices that work for the people that I was working with and for myself. And that was that I've got a choice about the future. I can write the script for the future. And if I take some responsibility for the kind of future I want to have, by the way, nobody ever gets to play the third act. It's always the second act wherever I am. It's always the current era wherever I am. But my point is that the third act, the future into which I'm living, has an enormous impact on the current era. And it becomes a really good guide in making choices about dealing with whatever is present for myself.
In a way,
Thanks for the time.
thank you very much. In a way, this sets up perfectly, since Warren has had so many acts to his life and continues to find them. So,
You're going to make the final remarks. Okay, good. Thank you, Werner, because this is a perfect setup for almost the end of the second act, because I tend to live there. But I've gone through a lot of tongue biting this morning, wanting to get up here. But I want to tell you, I want to make a comment, an observation, and then I want to raise a question that my dear niece, Phyllis Bennis, raised earlier, and I want to get back to it because it raises a whole lot of issues that I hope we can get to in the third. And I don't know why we're ending in the fourth act, Warren. That's another question to take. I mean, but it's not a bad metaphor. The first thing, the comment I want to make is this. Nehru, we talked about Gandhi. Jim brought up Gandhi this morning. Nehru once said about Gandhi that he made India proud of herself. I've always thought about that, about leadership, about making people proud to be in an organization. And I must tell you, as I look around the room, and I look at all these faces, most of whom I know have worked with, cough, cough, co-authored with, you made me proud of my field. You made me proud to be part of a field that is still asking big questions, is still really in the jungle of wondering aloud, having the guts to wonder aloud with each other. It's an amazing thing to be a part of. And you know, we've all had our arguments, our ups and downs, the disputes, but overall the idea of being a part of a field, which, to go back to what Uri Herscher said about the word courage, it wasn't mentioned, but it's in the air, because anybody interested in the inquiry of leadership, anybody who's interested in doing it, are very brave, courageous souls. To operate in a field where you hold the consequences for other people's lives, you leaders sitting out there, I mean, to realize that you're playing for mortal stakes every day, that's guts. And then the question of, we have a little easier time, those of us who write about it, we have a little easier time, I think, although there's always tenure problems, I know, you know all that stuff, and type A journals, but you know, we are all, this morning, and I know there's still more acts to come, made me feel very proud of being a part of this group of people, and how courageous we all are for the ridiculous, sometimes, challenges we face, both doing it and trying to understand this thing which goes all over the map. You know, and the question I want to raise gets back to something that Phyllis raised this morning. I think it's something that we're going to think about as time goes on. I don't know whether it's, you know, it's not quite related to the group of speakers here and also the group this morning, as well as the respondents. It's interesting that Phyllis brought up the Manhattan Project and Oppenheimer and the result of that, which ended that war. Here we are in a field trying to study it, trying to understand the moral, ethical implications of the results. I want to tell you something about that, Phyllis. And I argue with my family about this, and I argue with my students about this. In 1945, on August 6th, I was an officer of the day. That meant I was a first lieutenant in Germany, Heidelberg, August 6, 1945. And OD, that didn't mean overdose then, it meant officer of the day, which meant I traveled around to various posts in Heidelberg and talked to the various enlisted men who were in those various posts. And when I got to one post, this young soldier, a private, said to me, Lieutenant, have you heard the news? I said, what are you talking about, soldier? He said, the news on AFN, just on the Armed Force, just came through. We've exploded some kind of a bomb over Tokyo. Oh, I'm sorry, over Hiroshima. I said, quiet down, soldier. What are you talking about? He said, some megaton, 1,000-ton thing, it was no name, has just exploded over Hiroshima, and the Japs, he said, may announce defeat. I said, we turned the radio on, we listened to it again, and he looked at me and he said, Lieutenant, now we can have our lives back. Now I say that not to make the moral case for what happened, because when the first nuclear device was tested in the desert of Los Alamos a month before, in July of 45, young Dr. Feynman, not yet with a PhD, was sitting with Oppenheimer in the bunker along with many other scientists who gained fame, Kistiakovsky and many others. And Oppenheimer looked at Feynman and said, now we're all sons of bitches. Now, the Manhattan Group got together in January of 1943. Less than 2 years later, that was the bomb result that ended that war. A year earlier, in what was once a wealthy suburb of Berlin, in a place called Wannsee, called the Wannsee Conference, a group of German goal-lighters sat together. Eichmann was their secretary. Given the meticulosity of the Germans, thorough notes were taken of that meeting, where they decided to kill all the remaining Jews left in Europe. And they figured it out. And there are no moral questions asked. Barbara, who led that group? Heydrich. Heydrich, right, thanks. Heydrich was a terrific, oh man, did he know how to run a committee? And in 90 or less minutes, they solved the Jewish solution. So where does the issue of results, of values, of the spirit of right and wrong, we've got to start to understand. I'm frankly bewildered by those two meetings. When I was with that soldier on August 6, 1945, and he looked at me and said, Lieutenant, we can have our lives back. I can't be objective. When I have to say and I think we need to really, really understand the root of that difference between those two meetings, both, by the way, with terrific results. And in one case, you could say it was the most destructive result, and I would argue being there at that time, I'm not sure how objective I can be about that. And my argument with my darling niece, whom I'm so proud of, is still one that haunts me. And these issues of leadership haunt me. And the beauty of the bravery of this field, Uri, who don't give me that stuff that you're not a leader. We'll talk to you. He started the Skirball Institute on nothing and has built it into a formidable, institution in Los Angeles, and is a personal friend and a rabbi of great standing. I just really want to raise the question, but I also want to tell you how proud I am at being a part of this incredible search we're involved with. But that's courage and bravery, and I think we just ought to keep at it. And
No, you won't remember, but Alan's chair was trying to get you and me together. Yes.
Thank you very, very much, Warren. And let me thank all the panelists for their time and energy and intelligence. Thank all of you for contributing and participating. After that wonderful speech, Warren, I got to make the exciting announcement that we move from the emotional and the cognitive to the gastric. Lunch is in the Regatta Bar just around the lobby. Be sure to start at 2. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Have a good afternoon. So that's in here. Yes. Thank you, Warren.